Good morning, everybody. It's the last day, and I think it's going to be very difficult to keep your attention. This is growth is not a very exciting topic, so it's something. I will start by start by telling you what is my bottom line. The question was, what is the growth agenda under the new normal? So my main message is that if we recall when the world economy was like euphoric in the 90s and 2000s and so on, even before the financial crisis, MENA countries did not benefit that much from that globalization process. They were not sufficiently integrated, open in the global economy, and they lacked the dynamics that are necessary for taking advantage of the possibilities of the global economies. So if we take that, if we remember that, it follows, to me logically, that if there is any new normal, and we saw yesterday that it is not clear that there is going to be a new normal, even if there were one, and there is slowdown in growth, global growth and trade, this is not going to impact that much the MENA countries. If you don't benefit from the upswing, you are not going to lose on the downswing, if you like. So that's my main message, and it follows from that the last message that really the key to future growth and the agenda for growth for MENA countries really is domestic issues. And I will try to say a few things about those issues domestically. So that's the main bottom line that I am trying to explain here. Now, what is this? Okay, it works. Okay. So in order to illustrate my arguments and my points, I will narrow the attentions to 4 countries. Specifically, I selected 4 countries, which are Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan, because I wanted to stay away from oil and oil prices and oil-rich countries. So to illustrate things that are really specific to this type of countries where they are not in big conflict, they are not in oil, so they are kind of limit a little bit the scope because the region is so complex and so multifaceted. So I will start by talking a little bit about stylized facts of growth in the 20 years before, and then I will talk about prospects of the future. And I will do it in 2 steps. Initially, I would like to talk about demographics. There's something happening in the region on demographics. And then I will talk about the new normal and the potential impact of the new normal on growth. I don't have much time to talk about data. Data are essentially from WDI, from the World Bank. Employment data are from the ILO, and the demographics are from the UN 2017 projection, the latest projection available. Okay. This is an important point. So let me start with the experience with growth in the since the 90s, since the, okay. When you look at these numbers, here, I try to put the numbers for the 4 countries in terms of average growth, employment growth, and productivity, labor productivity growth. The stylized facts are as follows, very simple. For the 4 countries, if we exclude Jordan, Jordan is a very special case, as you will see. It has very special dynamics, very interesting, as a matter of fact, because of the demographics and migration, in migration, out migration, and so on. It has very special. So if you take the 3 countries of Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia, the average growth over 20 years from early 90s to 2010, before the revolution, before the uprisings, was between 3.57 and 4.7% per year. So more or less They're very close, around 4% more or less, 4.5%. Now, the thing that surprised me, and I don't know if it surprises you, is that employment growth rates were high. Contrary to what is the received wisdom of low employment growth, actually, if you look at the data, you will find that employment growth was quite high, was between 2 and 3% per year in the countries involved. This is not negligible, high rates of growth of employment. And this means that labor productivity growth was low. It ranged from 1.1 to 2.2%, depending on the period and the countries and so on. So those are the broad outlines of the growth experience during those 20 years. Jordan is quite different. It had very extremely high growth rates, driven essentially by high labor force growth and employment growth, very high during some periods of time, but very low productivity growth. So the growth was essentially quantitative and driven by labor, driven by, after the 90s, the return from Iraq and so on, and the return from the Gulf, and all these dynamics, which is very, very, very specific. The third stylized factor, which is I was surprised to find this. When you plot productivity growth and employment growth, you find a negative correlation. It's very strange. I wasn't expecting to see that. So it seems like when employment growth is high, it is low quality growth and low productivity growth for some reason. Is part of it statistical? Possibly. It's possibly statistical, but I think there is more to it than statistics. There is something real that when a country goes into high employment growth episodes, this is done through low quality jobs and low productivity jobs. That seems to be typical. So these are the stylized facts of the of this 20 years. Okay. Now, so keeping that in mind, giving this broad picture of growth, so I asked myself, the first question I asked myself, okay, what about the future? Given that the growth was driven essentially from this by employment, quantity of labor essentially was driving growth. Low productivity, labor productivity, high employment growth. Therefore, the growth rate of 3.7 to 4.7 was more than half of it, more than half, is due to labor growth. So the first question is, what are the prospects for employment growth in the future? So that's where the demographics come in. Okay. So I did a very simple exercise. So I tried to project working age population based on the UN projections, and I took some assumptions like constant labor force participation rates, constant unemployment rates, and so on, and project over the next 20 years the employment growth. And this is interesting. What you see immediately is that if everything remains constant, productivity remains the same, labor market functioning remains the same, growth is going to fall. Overall growth, there is a loss because employment growth has to fall because of the dynamics of population growth. The slowdown in employment, in population growth, working age population, and so on, is going to be translating into a loss of growth between the growth between 1 and 2 points of growth. What is this? Okay. So there is a loss in terms of growth by 1 to 2%, depending on the countries. So if everything remains the same, I don't see. If everything remains the same, overall growth will have to fall in the countries by 1 to 2 points because of the dynamics of labor and demographics, if you like. Of course, we cannot assume all of these variables to be constant. We saw the negative correlation between productivity and employment growth and so on. So it's not, but just to illustrate. So if there is a new normal in the region, I think the demographics is a new normal in the region. It's not the same as it used to be over the next 20 years. Of course, the country is different in terms of phases. Tunisia is different from Morocco, and Morocco from Egypt, and so on. But the dynamics is going into the same direction. So the first policy conclusion from this, for me, is that one of the sources of growth, one of the points of policy agenda growth is really to work on the labor force participation. And labor force means female labor force participation. So if you improve, for instance, if you increase the female labor force participation by 10 points over the next 20 years or so, and this is possible, Turkey has done it, you can gain between 0.3 to 0.5 points of growth over the next 20 years or so. So that's the first point of agenda in terms of growth. Since I have very little time left, and the chair is telling me that I have only a few minutes left.
10 minutes.
10 minutes left, which is not. I'm not going to talk too much about the uprisings and the impact of uprisings. There is a collapsing growth, declining growth by 1 and 2 points, between 1 and 2 points over the years 2011, 2015, due to labor force. We start seeing already over the last 7 years the decline in labor force growth and working age population growth, and decline in productivity as well. I don't have time to discuss this that much. So let me go to my main topic, which is growth prospects in terms of dealing with labor productivity, because that's the key. The key is really labor productivity. So we cannot expect to have a strong growth in the future, even if we improve the labor force participation and so on, unless there is a huge increase in labor productivity growth. And my point is that we need at least to double labor productivity growth over the last 20 years or so. And this implies a lot of things, and I'd like to explore some of these ideas. Low productivity growth is associated with low total factor productivity growth, and total factor productivity growth, low growth, is associated with limited structural transformation. And at the same time, what we see in the past, most of the total factor productivity growth was associated with capital deepening and not structural transformation in the region. And these are some of the numbers. You see that TFP is less than 1% in these countries. And the contribution of structural transformation from the studies that have been done is typically negative or very, very low. So no structural transformation as a source of growth happening. And while structural contribution of capital deepening is really the biggest contributor to TFP growth and to productivity growth. So I don't want to spend too much time. So limited structural transformation, you can see it if you look at the share of manufacturing. Has peaked many years ago, and we are on downward trend in terms of manufacturing share of GDP. So there is no really major structural transformation, and all of the studies that have been done have shown that in many ways. So in that context, you say, okay, what if there were a new normal? If there were a new normal, will that impact the prospects for structural transformation or not? And obviously, if there were, it's true, because if trade growth is slowing down and so on, your prospects for achieving manufacturing growth or exports and so on will be limited. There will be headwinds, and then this limits the scope for structural transformation, as it were. But the basic, as I said earlier, the basic contribution to growth, as we've seen in the past, has been capital deepening, capital accumulation. The largest contribution is Egypt and Morocco. As I said, Jordan is not the case. It was essentially labor growth and not capital deepening, and so on. So how about the impact of new normal on capital accumulation? We know historically that the fact that capital deepening has been a major source of growth, in total it was not very strong because capital accumulation rates were not very high. I wouldn't say low, but they are not very high. They are average, if you like. We have historically low investment rates, low savings rates, especially in Egypt. They are higher in Morocco and Tunisia. They are low in Egypt. And therefore, when you compare to the success countries like China and so on, there is no way you can compare. Very interesting example that I was not aware of, but I discovered in Morocco, what has happened in Morocco over the recent period. There was an episode of very high investment rates which took place between the end of the 90s and the 2000s. For about 10 years, the investment rates increased by about 7 to 8 percentage points of GDP over 10 years. Very sustained increase in investment rates. And that investment rate was essentially public sector investment rate. The private sector was constant. The public sector increased investment. Essentially infrastructure, big investment in infrastructure. And this clearly was a source of capital deepening. There was an increase in growth. But this was not sustainable, clearly, because the savings rate did not increase. And the country ran very quickly into balance of payment and the budget deficits and so on, and therefore was not sustained. So this episode really shows clearly that you cannot increase investment rates unless there are other things, unless your savings rates increase as much. And this seems to be the key to what the potential for increasing capital deepening is. So what would be the impact of a new normal on capital accumulation? Here I try to do a very simple correlation, see if there are any relationship between what happens in the rest of the world and what happens in these countries. And very surprisingly, very little correlations. So when you look at the growth rate in the EU, very little impact on growth in the countries of MENA. Financial conditions don't seem to impact investment in the countries of the region. So there is very little impact of global conditions, if you like, on the countries of the region, which means that a new normal is really not very much relevant, is not very much relevant to impact the countries of the region, the growth prospects. So the domestic considerations, domestic conditions are really critical for what will happen in growth. So what is required for higher investment rates in that case and higher capital growth? I think, as I said, there is limited impact of global factors and dominance of domestic factors. The solution by increasing public investment are limited because the Moroccan experience shows that this is not sustainable. And therefore, the potential has to come from domestic factors. And the critical issues are about savings, about thrift, savings in the countries, about trust, credibility and trust in private investment, for private investment, and regional and domestic political stability seem to be critical for that. So the agenda has to focus on these three areas, three dimensions, which is how to increase savings rates, and this is a big agenda, and how to increase the credibility and trust in the public sphere, and the increased improvement in social, in regional and domestic political stability as such. So going forward, I would like to summarize. I have 1 minute? Yeah.
You have 3 minutes.
So the keys, for me, the keys to the future growth prospects of the region lie in these 3 points. First is how to go beyond crony capitalism, which was the only driver for private investment that has been taking place in the region, to go into innovative private sector, an innovative private sector. So that's the first point of the agenda, I think, and that's it has a political and economic dimensions. This requires incentives. The incentives have to be to reward performance and innovation and not reward trends and rent-seeking behaviors. So to me, the future agenda of the growth in the region, which hinges on private investment and increased capital deepening, as well as structural transformation and improved productivity growth, lies really in achieving a private sector which has these characteristics, which is innovative, is not trend-seeking, is not crony capitalism, and so on. And so this is really domestic. It's not about new normal, it's not about the global conditions, it's domestic agenda, and that is really the critical point. So I hope that through that, if that point is really, if you agree with that, this opens clearly the path to the policy agenda for growth in the next 20, 30 years in the region. Thank you very much. I will stop.